Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. History remembers him as the Drunkard, the son who fell from the magnificent heights of his father, Suleiman. But this is the story of the man who conquered the island of Venus, Cyprus, and then watched his invincible navy burn to ashes in a single afternoon at Lepanto. He was a prince who survived by feigning weakness, a sultan ruled by his Grand Vizier and his wife, a conqueror and a catastrophe. This is the story of Selim II, the Sultan of Wine and War. In the year 1524, within the opulent, labyrinthine walls of the Topkapi Palace, a child was born. He was not the first son, nor would he be the last. He was simply another prince, another potential heir to the most powerful throne on earth. His name was Selim. His father was Suleiman, a name that echoed with the force of 1,000 cannons, a man history would remember as the Magnificent. To be the son of such a man was to be born in a shadow so vast it could eclipse the sun. From his first breath, Selim was enveloped in a world of paradox. He was surrounded by unparalleled luxury, silks from Persia, jewels from India, servants who materialized at the slightest gesture. Yet, this gilded cage was also a waiting room for death. The Ottoman law of succession, the brutal code of fratricide, meant that every brother was a rival, every male relative a potential threat to be eliminated upon a new sultan's ascension. While Suleiman was conquering Rhodes, marching on Hungary, and making the Mediterranean an Ottoman lake, his sons were learning a different kind of warfare. It was a war fought with whispers in shaded courtyards, with carefully chosen words in the divan, and with the silent, watchful eyes of their powerful mother, Sultan. Selim, with his fair skin and reddish-blonde hair, stood out physically from his more swarthy, martial brothers. From an early age, he seemed less interested in the arts of war and conquest that had defined his father's reign. He did not possess the raw charisma of his older half-brother, Mustafa, nor the fiery ambition of his full brother, Bayezid. He was a quieter soul, drawn to poetry, music, and the delicate pleasures of the palace gardens. But in the Ottoman court, a lack of overt ambition was not seen as a virtue. It was perceived as weakness, a fatal flaw in a world where only the most ruthless survived. The weight of his father's legacy was a mountain, and Selim was just a boy standing at its base, looking up into an impossible climb. He was a prince of the blood, but he lived under a suspended sentence, his fate tied not to his own desires, but to the grand, terrible machinery of the imperial throne. As the princes grew into men, their true natures began to crystallize, hardened by the constant pressure of the court. While Bayezid drilled with the janissaries and dreamed of campaigns, and Mustafa governed his province with a competence that both impressed and terrified his father, Selim cultivated a different reputation. Whispers began to circulate, carried on the scented air of the harem and the hushed tones of the Grand Viziers. They spoke of Prince Selim's fondness for wine. In an empire governed by Islamic law, where alcohol was forbidden, this was more than a personal failing. It was a political liability, a stain on the sacred persona of a potential caliph. The stories painted a picture of a prince who preferred the company of poets and musicians to generals, a man more at home in a lavish pavilion with a goblet of forbidden Cypriot wine than on a battlefield. This reputation earned him a nickname that would follow him to the grave, Selim the Sot. But was it the full truth? Or was this weakness a carefully constructed mask? In the deadly game of Ottoman succession, appearing non-threatening could be the ultimate survival strategy. A prince who was seen as a drunkard, a pleasure seeker concerned only with his own comfort, was a prince who might be overlooked by his more ambitious rivals. He would not be perceived as a threat until it was too late. Selim was an intelligent man, a patron of the arts, who commissioned some of the most beautiful architecture of the era, including the Grand Mosque in Edirne that bears his name. He was not a fool. His indulgence could have been a genuine escape from the crushing anxiety of his position, a way to numb the constant fear of the bowstring that awaited the losing brother. or it could have been a brilliant piece of political theatre. By embracing the persona of the hedonist, he lowered the guard of his enemies. He allowed his brother Bayezid to appear as the more dangerous, more immediate threat to their father's power. Selim's weakness, whether real or feigned, became his shield. In a world of sharp blades and sharper ambitions, he surrounded himself with the soft cushions of pleasure, biding his time, waiting as the shadow of his magnificent father grew longer and the day of reckoning drew ever closer. The Ottoman Empire was a world built for one ruler, but it produced many sons. This fundamental conflict turned the imperial family into a cauldron of suspicion and fear. For Selim and his brothers, childhood affection was a luxury they could not afford. It was poisoned by the absolute certainty that one day they would be forced to destroy one another to survive. At the forefront of this deadly contest was Shehzade Mustafa, Selim's older half-brother. Son of Mahidevran, Hurrem Sultan's great rival, Mustafa was the embodiment of the ideal Ottoman prince. He was a skilled warrior, a just governor, and immensely popular with both the army and the common people. They saw in him the reflection of a young Suleiman, and they adored him for it. This adoration was his greatest asset and his most fatal flaw. Every cheer for Mustafa in the streets of his provincial capital was heard as a threat in the halls of Topkapi Palace. Then there was Bayezid, Selim's full brother. Fiery, impetuous, and fiercely ambitious, Bayezid was a warrior to his core. He chafed under his father's long reign, eager to prove his own mettle on the battlefield. He saw Selim's perceived indolence with contempt, viewing him as an unworthy rival, a soft obstacle to be brushed aside. The court fractured into factions, each prince a gravitational center pulling viziers, pashas, and janissary commanders into their orbit. Spies reported on every word, every gesture. A letter written in haste, a gift given to the wrong person, a public display of military prowess. Any of these could be twisted into evidence of treason. Selim navigated this treacherous landscape with cautious poise. While Mustafa was the shining sun and Bayezid the raging fire, Selim was like water, flowing around obstacles, assuming the shape of his container. He obeyed his father's commands without question, governed his assigned provinces competently, but without the flair that drew dangerous attention, and cultivated his reputation for being more interested in wine than in war. He watched as the two great rivals, Mustafa and Bayezid, moved towards their inevitable collision, knowing that their conflict was his opportunity. The brotherhood had dissolved. Now, there was only the cold calculus of survival. Behind the throne, veiled from public view, but holding the true strings of power, was a figure more formidable than any general, Hurrem Sultan. The former slave girl from Ruthenia had clawed her way to a position of unprecedented influence as Suleiman's legal wife. Her ambition was singular and absolute. One of her sons, and not Mustafa, the son of her rival, would inherit the empire. She was the master architect of the prince's rivalry. Hurrem understood the dynamics of power better than anyone. She knew that Mustafa's immense popularity was a direct threat not only to her sons, but to Suleiman's own authority. An aging sultan does not appreciate a beloved heir who seems too eager to take his place. With relentless, subtle precision, Hurrem and her powerful son-in-law, the Grand Vizier Rustem Pasha, began to weave a web around Mustafa. They intercepted letters, forged correspondence, and fed Suleiman a steady diet of whispers, suggesting that Mustafa, backed by the Janissaries, was planning a coup to seize the throne. Hurrem's gambit was to eliminate the greatest threat first. She played on Suleiman's deepest fears, of betrayal, of losing control, of being usurped as his own father had usurped his grandfather. In 1553, the trap was sprung. Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his campaign tent in Ereğli. The prince, despite the warnings of his advisors, obeyed his father's call. He entered the tent to greet the sultan and was met by royal executioners. He was strangled with a silk bowstring, his death silent and absolute, carried out in his father's presence. The empire convulsed in grief and outrage, but the deed was done. Hurrem had removed the primary obstacle. Now, only her own sons remained. She had long favored the more aggressive Bayezid, but his rebellious nature was becoming a liability. Selim, the compliant, seemingly harmless son, was looking more and more like the safer choice. Hurrem's final years were spent managing the escalating conflict between her two remaining sons, a fire she herself had stoked. Her great victory in destroying Mustafa had unleashed a new, more intimate war, one that would force her to choose between the children she had fought so fiercely to protect. In the gilded cafes and shadowy corridors of the Topkapi Palace, whispers were a currency more valuable than gold, and paranoia was the air one breathed. For Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, now an old lion weary from decades of war and rule, the greatest threat came not from the Habsburgs in Vienna or the Safavids in Persia, but from within his own bloodline. The law of fratricide, the brutal necessity that had secured the throne for generations, cast a long, dark shadow over his sons, Selim and Bayezid. The tension, simmering for years, finally erupted, not with the clash of swords, but with the rustle of parchment. A courier was intercepted, his cache of letters intended for the court of the Persian Shah, Tahmasp. The sender was Shehzade Bayezid. The contents were pure treason. In elegant, desperate script, Bayezid pleaded with the Ottoman Empire's most bitter rival for support, for sanctuary, for an army to use against his own father and brother. When the letters were laid before Suleiman, the old sultan's heart, already heavy with the execution of his firstborn Mustafa, must have fractured anew. This was not merely a son's ambition. It was a direct invitation to a foreign power to meddle in the sacred succession of the House of Osman. For Selim, who had played the part of the loyal, unassuming son, this was the moment of ultimate vindication. He had watched his brother's fiery ambition and military prowess with a quiet, calculating patience. Bayezid's rashness, his inability to conceal his hunger for the throne, had led him to this fatal error. The letters were a death sentence signed by his own hand. Suleiman, faced with irrefutable proof of rebellion, had no choice. He stripped Bayezid of his command and openly declared his support for Selim. The die was cast. The civil war that had been a whispered fear was now an imminent, bloody reality. The plains near Konya, a land steeped in the history of Seljuk sultans and spiritual mystics, were to become the stage for a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. In the spring of 1559, two Ottoman armies faced each other, not as comrades against a foreign foe, but as mortal enemies. On one side stood Shehzade Selim, the designated heir, his forces bolstered by the elite Janissaries and Sipahi cavalry dispatched by his father. His was the army of the state, disciplined, well-equipped, and marching with the full authority of the Sultan. On the other side was Shehzade Bayezid, the charismatic rebel, now declared an outlaw. His army was a smaller, more desperate collection of loyalists, Turkmen warriors, and those who gambled that his military genius could overcome the impossible odds. For Bayezid, this was a final, desperate throw of the dice. For Selim, it was the grim necessity of eliminating his last rival. The battle, when it came, was not a tactical masterpiece, but a brutal, chaotic slaughter. It was the horrific spectacle of brother against brother, of Ottoman steel cleaving Ottoman flesh. The Janissaries, the Sultan's own slave soldiers, advanced relentlessly, their muskets spitting fire into the ranks of Bayezid's men. Bayezid, a proven commander, fought with the fury of a cornered tiger, leading charges himself, trying to shatter Selim's lines through sheer force of will. But will alone could not defeat the might of the empire. Selim, observing from a safe distance, did not need to be a great general. He only needed to be the chosen son. As the day wore on, Bayezid's forces crumbled. The rebellion was broken, his army shattered. He fled the field not just as a defeated prince, but as a fugitive with a price on his head, the blood of thousands of his countrymen staining the soil behind him. Defeated and hunted, Shehzade Bayezid made the one choice left to him, a choice that sealed his doom. With his 4 young sons in tow, he crossed the border into the Safavid Empire, seeking refuge with the very man whose secret correspondence had condemned him, Shah Tahmasp. He threw himself upon the mercy of his father's greatest enemy. Initially, the Shah welcomed the Ottoman prince with lavish ceremony in his capital of Qazvin. Bayezid was a priceless pawn, a tool of immense leverage against the mighty Suleiman. But the Sultan was not a man to be trifled with, even in his old age. His response was not one of military threats, but of cold, relentless diplomacy and immense wealth. Ottoman envoys arrived in Persia not with declarations of war, but with chests overflowing with gold. The offer was simple and brutal: deliver the fugitives, and Persia would be rewarded handsomely. Refuse, and the fragile peace between the 2 empires would shatter. Shah Tahmasp, a shrewd and pragmatic ruler, weighed his options. Harboring Bayezid offered the slim possibility of future chaos in the Ottoman lands, but it guaranteed the immediate wrath of Suleiman. The gold, however, was real, and an alliance with the reigning sultan was far more valuable than the protection of a powerless exile. The decision was made. The hospitality turned to imprisonment. In a final chilling act of statecraft, Suleiman's executioner was granted safe passage to Qazvin. There, in a foreign palace, far from the homeland he had dreamed of ruling, Shehzada Bayezid was strangled with a silken bowstring. Then, one by one, his 4 sons, mere children, were executed in the same manner. The threat was neutralized. The bloodline was purged. Selim's path to the throne was now utterly, terrifyingly clear. With Bayezid and his sons silenced in a Persian grave, a strange, tense quiet descended upon the empire. Shehzada Selim, now in his 40s, was the sole, undisputed heir to the throne of Osman. The civil war was over, his rivals eliminated. Yet, he was not sultan. The throne remained occupied by the most formidable figure of the age, his father, Suleiman the Magnificent. The lion of the 16th century, though aged and racked by gout, still reigned. And so Selim waited. For 7 long years, he governed his province of Kütahya, a sultan in waiting, living in the immense, suffocating shadow of his father's legacy. What must have gone through his mind during this prolonged twilight? Did he feel the guilt of his brother's death, a price paid for his own security? Or did he see it as the cold, hard logic of power? He administered his lands, raised his family, and, according to many sources, found solace in the wine that would later define his reputation. He was waiting for a legend to die. The entire empire held its breath. Every report of the Sultan's failing health sent ripples of anticipation through the court. Finally, in 1566, the old lion roused himself for one last campaign, leading his army to besiege the fortress of Szigetvar in Hungary. It was there, in his war tent, on the eve of victory, that the 71-year-old Suleiman's epic life came to an end. The Grand Vizier, Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, made a decision of genius. He kept the Sultan's death a secret, even propping up the body to review the troops, to prevent chaos until Selim could be summoned. A message was dispatched. As Selim rode towards the capital, he was no longer the waiting prince. He was the Padishah, the inheritor of a world empire, a throne secured by his father's ruthlessness and his brother's blood. In the fading light of December 1574, death came not on a battlefield, nor in a grand throne room, but in the humid, marble-clad confines of a bathhouse. Selim II, the sovereign of the House of Osman, Caliph of the Muslims, slipped on the wet floor of the hammam he was having built in the Topkapi Palace. The fall itself was not immediately fatal, but a raging fever took hold. For days, the empire held its breath. Then, silence. The Sultan was dead. In that moment, the most powerful empire on earth became a stage for a perilous deception. The news could not be allowed to escape the palace walls. If the Janissaries or the rival princes learned of the power vacuum, the capital would erupt in chaos and civil war. The designated heir, Prince Murad, was weeks away in his governorate of Manisa. The state could not be without a head. The architect of this grand concealment was the unshakable Grand Vizier, Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, in concert with the late Sultan's formidable wife, Nurbanu Sultan. They became the keepers of a chilling secret. Selim's body was taken to a cold chamber and, according to chroniclers, packed in ice and snow to stave off the inevitable decay. For 12 agonizing days, the Ottoman Empire was ruled by a ghost. Sokolu Mehmed Pasha continued to hold court, issuing decrees and signing orders in the dead Sultan's name, claiming Selim was merely indisposed. Physicians would enter the Sultan's chambers and emerge with solemn reports of his slow recovery. Every whisper in the palace corridors was a potential threat, every questioning glance a challenge. It was a race against time, a desperate gamble played with the corpse of a monarch, waiting for the footfalls of the new master to echo through the palace gates before the secret thawed and revealed its horrifying truth. When Prince Murad finally arrived in Constantinople, he was smuggled into the palace under the cover of darkness, a shadow slipping through the very gates he was now master of. Only then did Sokolu Mehmed Pasha and Nurbanu Sultan reveal the truth. His father, Selim II, was dead. The throne was his. But the crown of the Ottoman Empire was never placed upon a head without a price, and that price was paid in blood. Murad III, now Sultan, faced his first and most terrible duty. The law of fratricide, a brutal but effective policy institutionalized by Mehmed the Conqueror to prevent the succession wars that had nearly torn the empire apart, demanded the execution of all rival claimants. Murad had 5 younger half-brothers, princes of the royal blood, living within the palace's gilded cage. As Murad took his place on the throne and received the allegiance of the viziers and the janissary commanders, another, more gruesome ceremony was unfolding in the deep recesses of the palace. The chief executioner, the Bostan Sirbasha, and his deaf-mute assistants were given their orders. One by one, the young princes, Suleiman, Abdullah, Cihangir, Mustafa, and Osman, were approached. There was no trial, no public accusation, only the cold, silent finality of the silken bowstring, the prescribed method for executing royalty so that no sacred blood was spilled. The public celebrated the accession of a new, vigorous sultan. They heard the cannons roar and the imams chant his name in the mosques. But within the walls of the seraglio, the mothers of the dead princes wept, and a new reign began, consecrated by the ghosts of 5 murdered brothers. This act would cast a long shadow over Murad's soul and his rule, an inaugural horror that cemented his power, but perhaps fractured his spirit. With Murad III on the throne, a question hung in the air of the Divan, the imperial council. Who truly ruled the Ottoman Empire? The new sultan was young, untested, and had spent years away from the intricate politics of the capital. The answer, for now, was the same man who had effectively ruled under his father, Sokolu Mehmed Pasha. The Grand Vizier was more than a minister. He was the state itself. A product of the Devshirme system, a Serbian boy taken as a blood tax, he had risen through sheer brilliance and ruthless efficiency to become the most powerful man in the empire, second only to the Sultan in name, and often his superior in practice. He had served Suleiman the Magnificent in his final years, steered the entire reign of Selim II, and now he managed the fragile transition to Murad III. Sokolu was the empire's anchor. While Selim had indulged in his pleasures, it was Sokolu who rebuilt the navy after the disaster at Lepanto with astonishing speed, famously telling the Venetian ambassador, "In conquering Cyprus from you, we have cut off one of your arms. In defeating our fleet, you have only shaved our beard. An arm cut off cannot grow again, but a shorn beard will grow all the stronger." He controlled the treasury, the army, and the labyrinthine bureaucracy. For the young Murad, Sokolu was both a necessary guide and an imposing shadow. The Grand Vizier's experience was indispensable, his authority absolute. But his dominance created a silent tension. Murad was the Sultan, the shadow of God on earth, yet he was beholden to his father's servant. This imbalance of power could not last. The harem, and the Sultan's ambitious mother, were already beginning to see the Grand Vizier not as the pillar of the state, but as the primary obstacle to their own influence. While Sokollu Mehmed Pasha commanded the world of men from the Grand Vizier's office, a new, formidable power was consolidating its influence from behind the sequestered walls of the imperial harem. This was the era of the Sultanate of Women, and its new matriarch was Nurbanu Sultan. With her son Murad's accession, she ascended from the role of Haseki, chief consort, to the ultimate position of power for a woman, Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother. Her story was the stuff of legend. Believed to be Cecilia Venier Baffo, the illegitimate daughter of a noble Venetian family, she was captured by corsairs and presented to the Ottoman harem. There, her intelligence, beauty, and cunning captivated Prince Selim, and she rose to become his favorite and the mother of his heir. She was not merely a palace ornament, she was a shrewd political operator. As Valide Sultan, her power became institutional. She controlled a vast privy purse, commanded the loyalty of a network of eunuchs and officials, and acted as her son's primary advisor. Her chambers became a second court, a center of political gravity that rivaled the Grand Vizier's divan. She engaged in her own diplomacy, corresponding directly with foreign rulers like Catherine de' Medici of France and the Doge of Venice. Her pro-Venetian policies, born of her own heritage, often put her at odds with the more hawkish Sokollu. Nurbanu understood that the Grand Vizier's immense authority diminished her son's, and by extension, her own. She began to carefully cultivate alliances and whisper in Murad's ear, planting seeds of doubt against the old statesman. The stage was set for a titanic struggle, a cold war fought not across battlefields, but in the corridors of Topkapi Palace, between the old guard, represented by the Grand Vizier, and the new power of the harem, embodied by the Venetian Queen Mother. In the gilded halls of the Topkapi Palace, a narrative was spun for the common man, a tale as intoxicating as the liquid at its heart. It was said that Sultan Selim II, the blonde sultan, coveted the island of Cyprus for a single reason: its exquisite wine. A simple, human desire for a sovereign who seemed all too human. But this was a convenient fiction, a veil draped over the cold, hard calculus of empire. The truth of Selim's obsession was etched not on a wine goblet, but on the strategic maps of the Grand Vizier, Sokollu Mehmed Pasha. Cyprus was a dagger aimed at the soft underbelly of the Ottoman world. From its harbours, Venetian-tolerated Christian corsairs bled the vital shipping lanes between Istanbul, Alexandria, and the Levant. Grain shipments to the capital were plundered. Worse, the pilgrim routes to Mecca and Medina were under constant threat, an intolerable affront to the Sultan's title as caliph and protector of the holy cities. For decades, the island had been a festering wound. For Selim's father, the great Suleiman, it had been a problem to be managed. For Selim II, it became a singular focus, a chance to etch his own name into the annals of conquest. Living in the colossal shadow of his father, Selim needed a victory that was unequivocally his. While the astute Sokollu advocated for a campaign against the Spanish in North Africa, or quelling a rebellion in Yemen, Selim was immovable. He was swayed by the war-hungry whispers of men like Lala Mustafa Pasha, who saw glory and riches in a Mediterranean campaign. The Sultan, often seen as passive and content to delegate, had found his cause. It was an obsession fueled by strategic necessity, religious duty, and the deep psychological need of a son to eclipse his father's legacy. The wine was merely the poetry. The prose was written in gunpowder and steel. The Sultan's will, once declared, became the empire's command. From the winter of 1569, the imperial arsenal on the Golden Horn transformed into a vision of hellish industry. The air grew thick with the smoke of forges and the scent of pine tar, the nights shattered by the ceaseless ringing of 10,000 hammers. This was not merely the preparation for war, it was the mobilization of a superpower at the absolute zenith of its might. Under the meticulous eye of the Grand Vizier, Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, a fleet of unprecedented scale was born. Shipwrights, carpenters, and ironmongers were conscripted from across the empire, their hands shaping a forest of timber into instruments of conquest. Over 350 ships were laid down, repaired, or retrofitted. Towering galleasses, floating fortresses bristling with cannon, were designed to shatter enemy formations. Sleek, swift galleys, the backbone of the fleet, were constructed by the dozen, each demanding a crew of hundreds of rowers, sailors, and soldiers. The logistics were staggering. Mountains of hardtack biscuit, barrels of water, and tons of munitions were stockpiled. Across Anatolia and Rumelia, the summons went out. Elite janissaries, the Sultan's slave soldiers, sharpened their yataghan swords. Sipahi cavalrymen, the feudal lords of the empire, gathered their retainers. An army of over 60,000 men was being assembled, a force intended not just to fight, but to overwhelm. This grand armada was more than a military tool. It was a declaration. It was the physical manifestation of Ottoman power, a statement to Venice and all of Christendom that the Mediterranean, the White Sea, as the Turks called it, belonged to the Sultan. As the spring of 1570 thawed the Bosphorus, the fleet stood ready, a crescent of masts and banners stretching as far as the eye could see. It was considered unsinkable, invincible, the final argument in the Sultan's obsession. After the swift fall of Nicosia, the entire weight of the Ottoman invasion force crashed against the walls of a single city, Famagusta. Here, Venetian defiance found its champion in the commander Marcantonio Bragadin. With a mere 7,000 men, he faced Lala Mustafa Pasha's army of tens of thousands. What followed was not a battle, but a descent into primal brutality that would last for nearly a year. The Ottomans, masters of siegecraft, unleashed a relentless storm. Their massive cannons pulverized the city's magnificent Renaissance-era walls day and night, reducing stone to dust. Elite janissaries hurled themselves at the breaches in wave after suicidal wave, only to be met by the desperate fury of the Italian and Greek defenders. Below ground, a silent, deadly war was fought as Ottoman sappers dug tunnels to mine the walls, and Venetian engineers dug counter-tunnels to meet them in the dark with pickaxe and blade. As months dragged on, Famagusta became a charnel house. The defenders, their numbers dwindling, were racked by starvation and disease. They ate rats, cats, and boiled leather to survive, but their will did not break. 6 major assaults were repulsed, costing the Ottomans an estimated 50,000 casualties. Finally, with his last gunpowder spent and his men ghosts of their former selves, Bragadin accepted terms of surrender. Lala Mustafa Pasha offered an honourable peace. The surviving defenders could march out with their flags and arms and be given safe passage to Crete. But as Bragadin arrived to hand over the keys to the city, the Ottoman commander's mood turned black. Accusing the Venetian of murdering Turkish prisoners, he ordered his guards to seize the delegation. A massacre ensued. Bragadin was forced to watch his lieutenants hacked to pieces before he was subjected to days of ritual torture and mutilation. The promise of honour had been a lie. The siege had ended, but an atrocity that would echo across the Christian world had just begun. News of the fall of Nicosia, and later the horror of Famagusta, travelled slowly but hit Europe with the force of a physical blow. In the Vatican, the aged Pope Pius V, a man of ascetic faith and iron will, saw the crisis not as a mere geopolitical setback, but as a spiritual emergency. For him, this was a battle for the soul of Christendom. He renewed his desperate calls for a holy league, an alliance he had been trying to forge for years against the bickering, self-interested Christian powers. His task was monumental. The Republic of Venice, though bleeding, was pragmatic and suspicious of its rivals. They feared Spanish ambitions in Italy as much as they feared the Ottoman Sultan. King Philip II of Spain, the most powerful monarch in Europe, was cautious and calculating. His vast empire was already stretched thin, fighting Protestant rebels in the Netherlands and Moriscos at home. He saw the Ottoman threat primarily through the lens of North Africa, not the distant Levant. The Pope, however, was relentless. He dispatched legates, wrote impassioned letters, and used every ounce of his spiritual authority, threatening and cajoling in equal measure. He framed the conflict in apocalyptic terms, a crusade against the infidel to save civilization itself. The turning point was the story of Marcantonio Bragadin. When the gruesome details of his flaying and the desecration of his body reached the courts of Europe, it ignited a firestorm of outrage. The calculated barbarism of Lala Mustafa Pasha did what years of papal diplomacy could not. It shamed the princes of Europe into action. Personal rivalries and strategic calculations were, for a moment, eclipsed by a shared sense of horror and a thirst for righteous vengeance. In May 1571, the Treaty of the Holy League was finally signed between the papacy, Spain, and Venice. A fragile, fractious alliance was born, forged in the crucible of Venetian desperation, Spanish ambition, and papal zeal. A great Christian armada began to assemble, its destination unknown, its fate hanging in the balance. The autumn winds of 1571 carried more than the scent of salt and cypress across the Gulf of Patras. They carried the weight of an empire's pride. Anchored near Lepanto, the magnificent Ottoman fleet, the largest armada the world had ever seen, was a forest of masts and crimson banners. At its head was Muezzinzadeh Ali Pasha, a court favourite of Selim II, a man more accustomed to the perfumed halls of Topkapi Palace than the splintered deck of a war galley. He was not a sailor, but he was the Sultan's man, and he carried the Sultan's will to find the Christian fleet and annihilate it. The pressure from Istanbul was immense. The conquest of Cyprus had been a brutal, costly affair, and Selim demanded a final glorious victory to consecrate it. Within the admiral's cabin, however, the mood was not one of unified confidence. A voice of caution, weathered by decades of war at sea, tried to pierce the veil of arrogance. It belonged to Uluç Ali Reis, the Bey of Algiers, a corsair of legendary skill and cunning. He had tasted Christian steel before, and knew the Venetians and Spanish were not to be underestimated. He argued for prudence, for using the fleet to raid, and harry, to draw the enemy into treacherous waters, to fight on their own terms. To seek a pitched battle, he warned, is to gamble the entire fleet on a single throw of the dice. But his was a voice from the periphery, a pirate's counsel in a pasha's war. Pertev Pasha, another commander, echoed Ali Pasha's aggressive stance, fueled by a desire for glory and plunder. The debate was a clash of worlds, the calculated risk of the sea-wolf against the blind ambition of the courtier. Ali Pasha, holding the Sultan's authority, made his decision. He would not wait. He would not hide. He would meet the Holy League in open water and break them. The order was given. Oarsmen were roused, anchors were weighed, and the great fleet began to move out of the safety of the Gulf, sailing towards a destiny it could not comprehend. It was an order born of hubris, a command that would seal the fate of 40,000 men. On the morning of October 7th, the two fleets met. A crescent of over 200 Ottoman galleys faced a disciplined line of Christian ships, and for a moment, the sea held its breath. The Ottoman war drums began their thunderous rhythm, a sound that had broken armies and terrified cities. But this day, something was different. From the Christian line lumbered 6 strange, towering vessels, the Venetian galleasses. They were floating fortresses, bristling with cannons on all sides. As the Ottoman fleet surged forward, these behemoths opened fire, their broadsides tearing through the tightly packed galleys. Oars were shattered, hulls were ripped open, and men were turned to red mist before they could even draw their swords. The Ottoman formation, designed for ramming and boarding, was thrown into chaos. At the center of the inferno was Ali Pasha's flagship, the Sultana, locked in a death struggle with Don Juan of Austria's Real. The decks became a slaughterhouse of hacking scimitars, Spanish steel, and the roar of arquebuses. Janissaries, the elite of the empire, fought with desperate courage, but they were overwhelmed. Ali Pasha, wounded and defiant, was cut down. A Spanish soldier severed his head and raised it on a pike. At that moment, the great green and gold standard of the caliphs, embroidered with verses from the Quran, was pulled down from the mast. Its capture was more than a tactical loss. It was a spiritual catastrophe. As the banner fell, so did the heart of the Ottoman fleet. Panic spread like wildfire. Galleys collided, crews surrendered, and thousands of Christian galley slaves, unshackled in the chaos, rose up against their masters. The sea turned crimson, choked with wreckage, burning oil, and the bodies of the dead and dying. The divine wind that had carried the Ottomans to victory for centuries had abandoned them. On this day, the sea burned with the ashes of an empire's invincibility. The news of Lepanto struck Istanbul like a physical blow. The invincible fleet, the pride of the Sultan and the terror of the Mediterranean, was gone, annihilated. The city fell into a state of shock, then quiet panic. How did Selim II, the Sultan of the world, react? Chronicles are sparse, but one can imagine him in the gilded cage of his palace, the wine tasting bitter for the first time, as the scale of the disaster became clear. He had lost not just ships, but the empire's most experienced sailors, naval commanders, and elite Janissary marines. It was a loss of human capital that could take a generation to replace. The Christian world rejoiced, believing the Ottoman sea dragon had been slain for good. They had, however, underestimated the iron will of one man, the Grand Vizier, Sokollu Mehmed Pasha. While Selim may have wavered, Sokollu, the true architect of the state, did not. He was the empire's anchor in the storm. When the Venetian ambassador came to him, brimming with the confidence of victory, Sokollu delivered one of the most defiant pronouncements in diplomatic history. "In conquering Cyprus from you," he stated calmly, "we have cut off one of your arms. In defeating our fleet, you have merely shaved our beard. An arm, once cut off, will not grow again, but a shorn beard will grow all the stronger for the razor." This was no idle boast. Sokollu initiated a rebuilding program of breathtaking speed and scale. Every shipyard from the Black Sea to the Aegean roared to life. Forests were felled for timber, iron was brought from the mines, and artisans worked through the harsh winter by lamplight. Money, the sinews of war, was poured out from the treasury without limit. Within 6 months, a period so short it seemed impossible, a new fleet of over 150 galleys was launched. It was a miracle of logistics and a testament to the awesome power and resilience of the Ottoman state machine. The beard had grown back. By the spring of 1572, a new Ottoman fleet commanded by Uluç Ali, now Kapudan Pasha Kılıç Ali, put to sea. It was a stunning achievement. The Holy League, fractured by infighting, could not mount another unified campaign. Venice, seeing its arm had indeed been severed and its trade routes threatened anew, was forced into a humiliating peace. In 1573, it formally ceded Cyprus to the Ottomans and paid a massive war indemnity. On paper, the empire had won. Sokollu's gambit had paid off, but Lepanto had left a scar that could not be healed by new timber and fresh levies. The myth of Ottoman invincibility at sea was shattered forever. European powers now knew the Ottomans could be beaten in a head-on confrontation, a psychological shift that would embolden them for centuries to come. What, then, is the final verdict on Selim II? He is forever remembered as Selim the Sot, the Sultan who supposedly launched a war for a Cypriot wine he favoured. He was the first of the sultans to die not on the battlefield, but within the palace walls, in his case, from a fall in an unfinished bathhouse after a bout of drinking. He represents the beginning of a profound change in the nature of the sultanate. The warrior sultan, leading his armies from the front like his father Suleiman, was replaced by the reclusive palace dweller, detached from the gritty business of governance. Yet, his reign was not an unmitigated disaster. By entrusting the state to the brilliant Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, he allowed the imperial system to function at peak efficiency. The conquest of Cyprus was secured, Tunis was captured from the Spanish, and the empire's borders remained intact. His legacy is one of profound contradiction. An empire at the zenith of its power, governed by a man who was a shadow of his predecessors. His reign proved that the Ottoman state was, for a time, greater than the Sultan himself. But his personal example set a ruinous precedent, a slow-acting poison of indulgence and neglect that would eventually seep into the very foundations of the empire he inherited.